Let me take you back, not very long ago, but let's say something like what, 60 years ago perhaps, or thereabouts. Anyway, this is something that's going to be very interesting because a lot of people are wondering, what does it take to cover the office of the president? Well, I can only speak of the president that I covered a long, long time ago, not by way of comparing how it has been after that administration, but perhaps to see how it has evolved covering the office of the president. What does it mean, likewise, to be doing some stand-upper or doing a coverage of a live event or making a report as far as the activities of the commander-in-chief and the highest executive of the land is concerned? Well, let's go back to what year was this? Maybe even before President Marcos was president, sometime when he was still campaigning, for instance, for the presidential elections then. It was 1965 that you had that elections, where you had Diosdado Macapagal as the president and the incumbent also running for re-election. And then you had Marcos of the Nacionalista Party. It has been mentioned time and time again that there were only two political parties at the time, and that was the Nacionalista Party, and then you had the Liberal Party. And so the candidates of each party were the ones that were contending for the positions that were for elective offices. And so that was how it was. How did I get to meet President Marcos? Well, I'll probably cut short that meeting because that will go to another episode of Chronicles. But let's see what Malacañang was like. So 1965 was the campaign period, and that was the time when, well, there were not many private planes, so to speak, that one could hire or one could avail of. There were also difficult roads all over the country. We had very rough roads, as a matter of fact. So why did I cover this? Well, that's another story altogether. But that was the situation as it was then. You had to travel from one place to the other because television was not yet broadcast throughout the country. We did not have live telecasts coming from Manila, and then everybody else could see it. We did not have any satellite connections at the time. As a matter of fact, it took a long while before we could have broadcasts coming from any place of the country, and we even had to use the satellite facilities of Indonesia in Bukitnanas. I remember this because every time we had a coverage and we had to mention this is courtesy of Bukitnanas of Indonesia, etc., and all of this. Anyway, the campaign period at the time was from city to city. Not really, not all the cities, but where you had the major urban centers, if you would call it at the time, where there were more people actually gathering. And you would announce this, or the candidate would announce this. So-and-so will be arriving on this time, and so people would be gathering. And then the local politicians would also be there. And most of the time, you had already the stage prepared, and then perhaps there was a band to welcome and so forth. But the difficulty of traveling was there. Roads were not paved nor cemented, and in some places you didn't even have roads. So you had to go through what? Pathways? Well, particularly remembered, of course, is going to Mindanao, because that was supposed to be that place of our islands which was the most less developed in a way. So there were still big boulders on the road when you were traveling, for instance, from Davao to Cotabato, because well, there was a volcanic eruption of Mount Apo many hundred years before that, and some of those big boulders from the volcano were not yet cleared from the road, so you had to go around them and so forth. And there were rivers, a lot of rivers, because it was a mountainous region, and there were no bridges. But the rivers were not, there were certain areas of the rivers, and the drivers knew this, jeep drivers rather, would know this. So they would pass through the river. They placed some, I don't know, a plastic bag or something over the radiator or whatever it is, so that the water won't get in and you could cross. So that was how it was. And there were several areas likewise where there were no airports. So either you were using small Piper Cubs or small planes, and that was still also very difficult because not everybody could join. So the others were going by the road, and the others, well, would have to fly over, and that was how it was. So that was the first time that I actually saw up close and personal and professional, because I was also covering the presidential elections at the time, both Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, and that was where people would wait for hours, actually, waiting for Marcos to speak, because he already had the reputation of being quite an eloquent orator in a way, and Mrs. Marcos to sing. And a lot of people were quite eager because not everybody has seen Imelda Romualdez Marcos personally. So during that campaign, they were really, really more eager to see her. As a matter of fact, every time Marcos would speak, he would say something like, oh, alam ko, nakikinig kayo sa akin, pero ang tingin ninyo, nakatingin kayo kay Imelda. So be that as it may, that was how it was. And then, let us look at Malacañang at the time. How did I get there to cover the office of the president? That's another story. It will probably be in another episode of our Chronicles, but let's see what Malacañang was like at the time. It is not what it is today. There were wooden structures still. It was built in such a way to just to stretch out what it was before during the time of the Americans, when the Americans held our country, colonized our country, as a matter of fact, for 45 years. So that was where they had the office of the highest seat of the Governor General, the American Governor General. Of course, we also had our own Philippine officials. But that was the restructured Malacañang of the American period. And, you know, it was actually still the same structure in the way that you had the ceremonial hall. That is, when you enter, you go up the stairs, then you had the ceremonial hall. But it opened to a balcony. There was a balcony that was, you could actually see the Pasig River, or view the Pasig River from there. It was stretching out to see actually that, at the time, the Pasig River was not as foul-smelling as it is probably today, but it was still a good view that you had then. And then, of course, there were several other structures, which was on the other side where you have now, where you have the presidential library. But that was how it was. And inside the ceremonial hall, you had something like several settees. You had chairs and tables where people could sit and wait if they had an appointment and so forth. You did not yet have the main dining hall where a lot of cabinet meetings are usually being held now. But on the other side, you also had that ceremonial hall in another building, and that is where you still have a lot of events happening. And that was how it was. But when President Marcos was already president, and after I think about 3 or 4 years, Mrs. Marcos decided to renovate the entire Malacañang. At the time, he called it Malacañang Palace, but then it has become the People's Palace, and now you just simply say it's Malacañang. So when it was renovated, then really the changes that were done there was as it is, that you would see it today. The balcony was removed, and the ceremonial hall was expanded. Then you had the dining hall where you had where cabinet meetings were held, and then you had the rooms for the visitors of Mrs. Marcos. They called it the music room. And then on the other side, not on the other side, on the same row actually, you had the study room, which was where the president met with his guests. And so that was how it was as far as the official functioning places of Malacañang were. And then you had, of course, the big ceremonial hall. And on the other side, which was closer to the grounds actually, you had the residences. You had the rooms for each of the children, and then a long library actually, and then they had their own dining room. The kitchen was on the ground floor, and that was where you also had all of the pantry, all of the shelves, all of the different, all of those, yes, where you had the plates and the silverware that they used for state functions. And dami-dami niyan, because normally you had thousands of guests every time you had a big function there. And then the chandeliers were also changed. They were requested by Mrs. Marcos to be carved in paete. These are wooden chandeliers, and so she said, well, why don't we use our own instead of all of these chandeliers that were being imported from Vienna or from anywhere in Europe. So as you will see it now, those wooden chandeliers were handmade by the carvers of Paete, very famous for their carvings and for their woodwork, and that is as it is today. And so the ceremonial hall and the main banquet hall, they were all expanded. Then you had also the carpets, which are laid out. Sometimes it's red, sometimes it's yellow, but most of the time they just chose the red carpet. So that was how the events were actually being conducted. So, but then at that time, when I say that it's so different when it comes to covering the president, what I noticed then was there was not like it is today, where you have a separate room for the Malacañang press corps where they sit there. Then you had the presidential spokesperson speaking to them, telling them what the event was. At the time when we were doing our coverage of Malacañang, everybody was there. I mean, all the different representatives of the print media were there, and the print and radio were there at the hall itself. They would be seated in those different little chairs, not little, but the chairs alongside the big hall, the entrance hall, and they would wait. They would wait for any report coming from the president if he wishes to come out, and then he would talk to the press corps. And this was composed of even the foreign press. So they were sometimes, not sometimes, but often they were also there. So you could see that they would be surrounding him, and he would be talking to them, and they would ask questions of him. And that was how it was. It was not something that was as formal as the way you see it now in a room, which the president hardly ever goes to now with, after everything was renovated after 86. So that was how it was. You were just mixing around with everybody else. For television, it was only the government television station that was covering from inside the palace, and whatever was reported there was fanned out to the other private stations. But as I've said, everybody was mixing around, and we had a dress code. Like for the women, we don't wear pants. We had to be formally with our blazers, and the men likewise also had to be quite formally, not really very formally dressed, but officially dressed in such a way that there was a respect given to the office of the president. So it was so unlike the way you see it now, where you have press conferences with the president seated, and then the rest of the Malacañang Corps seated likewise in front of him. There were tables, they're in between them, and then you had all those questions and answers. You had the moderator, but at the time it was just the president surrounded by the press corps, and questions were coming in from everywhere. Contrary to what everybody thought, that since it was martial law from 1972 to 1983, that the press was being censored, or the press was being told what to print and what to say. It was not like that at all. Because, for instance, I was doing the coverage from the office of the president for live events. I was never told what to say, what to edit, what to talk about, what not to say, and so forth. So there was no censorship as far as I was concerned. And I was the only one there covering the president himself. So anyway, for the rest of those that were there, like I've said, Malacañang Press Corps, they also were not told, this is what you print, don't print that, and so forth. But everybody went his merry way. At least that was what I saw, and that was what I heard, and that is what was being broadcast on radio. And several of my colleagues perhaps would also testify to this. So people are saying that we were told not to do this. That was part of that. Well, perhaps now it can be told. Anybody that is there in the corridors of power has this, I don't know if it is a kind of, something pervades them in a way. They call it the sycophants. It's something like you always want to please whoever is the boss. You want to say something nice so that you gain favor from the boss. And perhaps that pervades just about every administration, even before Ferdinand Marcos and afterwards. So people are the ones who were, those actually, covering the office of the president would want to be in his favor or in the favor of whoever the powers are, so that they do not want to offend or they do not want to say any critical. It is the outside press, those that are not covering the office of the president, that are the ones that are more critical, and that is where you could say that, well, sometimes they're told you're becoming too much of an opposition and this is not right, or that is not, it is fake news. At the time you didn't even call it fake. It's an exaggeration, and you know how it is. Exaggeration is another form of falsification. But at the time, the way I understood things as they were going around Malacañang when we were covering the president himself, and I'm referring to Ferdinand Marcos, there was no such thing as, somebody telling us, even the Secretary of Information or Greg Sendanya, who was the head of the National Media Production Center, they were not giving notes and saying, this is what you say, or this is what you should not say. So that was how it was, a different atmosphere altogether, but definitely an atmosphere of respect. There was something about the ambiance in Malacañang during the time of Ferdinand Marcos, where actually, when you entered the palace, there was already this aura that somebody important is there, and something important is going to be told. So that is important for us to realize that we should walk with dignity and with respect. And there was a sense of great decency, As a matter of fact, believe it or not, I was not even able to cross my legs at any time during my entire coverage of the office of the president. That was how it was then. And that is why I want to share this with you in this, my chronicles, so that you would understand that at the time, we did not have any censorship covering the office of President Ferdinand E. Marcos.